Welcome to the DLS Decolonial Learning Session, Decolonizing Desires, Reimagining Sexuality in the Dutch Caribbean Landscape. This decolonial learning session will focus on decolonizing gender and sexuality in the Dutch Caribbean landscape with Wigbertson Julian Isenia. They are an interdisciplinary scholar and assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Amsterdam. They co-founded Black Queer Archives, which organizes panels and exhibitions on marginalized groups, such as queer activist groups of color from the 1970s and HIV and AIDS awareness among postcolonial migrants in the Netherlands. Their work focuses on gendered and sexual cultures in Curaçao, part of the Dutch Caribbean, by analyzing cultural practices such as archival collections, literature, theater, and cultural performances, combining ethnography and with archival work.
So this is this idea of coloniality versus colonialism. So in a sense, in a very basic sense, coloniality differs from colonialism in that sense that colonialism is a particular time period, right? So if you take the Dutch Caribbean after 1950, they are not officially actually a colony anymore, right? But as a lot of decolonial scholars also argue, that coloniality actually indicate a time period after colonialism where ideas of colonialism still persist. So indeed, it can persist in culture, labor, in ideas of relations, but also knowledge. And one example I have always during my teachings is the focus on English, right? And at the expense of very native languages and culture. And in the Netherlands, it's also the same. So for example, in Curaçao, in Aruba, only in the end of 2000s, 2006, if I'm not mistaken, in 2007, Pavimento became official language. But before that time, Dutch was the lingua franca in both of the islands in Curaçao. So coloniality is also this idea that this very dominant notion of superiority in terms of language and culture persists after colonialism. So this term was coined by Aníbal Quijano, and it addresses the enduring legacies and structure of colonialism. So it goes beyond, as I said, the period of former colonial rule. And for him, it was this concept that indicates not only legalities, but also the whole structure of the society. So going back to the social structure, the culture, how we think, what is important for us, the power relations, but also impacting racial and social hierarchies. If you have questions, please ask them. I cannot see them now, but I will address them in a bit. So Quijano traces this idea of a modern colonial world, right? So where certain parts of the world are claiming modernity, and because of that, some other countries or parts of the world are seen as not modern or so-called backward, right? So it traces this root of difference from 1492 when the Spanish stepped or colonized the Americas. And as I said, it works as a framework to disqualify others as unmodern or pre-modern or not modern enough. And in this sense, Europeans consider themselves as the the high ground of modernity and others as not modern enough. So they were put on a scale of who is modern, who is not modern. And in a sense, indigenous people were situated outside of modernity, and thus they were deemed so they can be enslaved by the Europeans or colonized by the Europeans. But of course, as Quijano also mentions in his article, that if we actually look at these societies, we can't this difference cannot actually be held up, right? So if you see all the inventions and palaces and pyramids and the cultures that they had, we cannot actually held this idea that they are so-called not modern or backwards. It even says that in a lot of these places, they were more developed actually than Europe. So here you can already see this idea of modernity is very much a construction, not per se true, right? As we also know. And for Quijano, as we will see also in a picture of different spheres of coloniality of power, he says that we can also see that now, right? So through the ways in which we think about capital, how economic transactions are taking place, and it's a way of as a common social practice that if you do not partake in this practice, you are left out. Yeah, so it's so overwhelming, overtaking, that it also dictates what others should do. So, for example, if we do not want to adopt a capitalist structure, as a country, we will be left out of the economic system of the world, right? So it also has big consequences, these ideas of coloniality of power. So it dictates also borders, ideas of family. So, for example, in his work, he also talks about how children were brought up by different families, for example. However, when the Europeans came, there was this idea of a patriarchal idea of family where the man is on top. The mother should stay home to look for the children. So there's also a hierarchy in terms of gender and in this patriarchal system. And also it relates to how individuals relate to the world, right? So it also relates to, it's not about per se how people see themselves, but it's more about how certain people, in this case Europeans, dictate a norm and thus see others to disqualify or not. So basically, we can see this idea of coloniality of power in these three spheres that are interlinked. So the yellow and the green should also be linked, right? So in that sense, coloniality of power is also linked to ideas of who is human, right? To ideas about what is important to know, which knowledge is important, who is able to produce this knowledge, and so on, so on. So these are all interlinked together. So this is a kind of a recap, a very fast one, to say that Maria Lugones then said, yes, I agree with this concept of coloniality of power, but we miss a crucial part of this scheme. So she introduces this idea of coloniality of gender in this scheme. So in that sense, she adds to this theory to say that gender is not a so-called natural thing. It's a constructed thing that was introduced by colonialism. So the ways in which we think about gender, for example, what is a man, what is a woman, but not only that, that they have different expectations also stems from colonialism. So in this article of chapter, The Coloniality of Gender, she expands on this idea of coloniality of gender to look at the ways in which different ideas, European ideas were introduced in the Americas, but also in the ways in which some indigenous ideas and cultures were erased because of that. So in a sense, she combines the intersection of colonialism, patriarchy, and gender together in this article. So again, this introduction of coloniality of gender introduces some expectations for women, for example. So even though in some communities, women were indeed responsible for caretaking, they had also leadership roles, right? So it didn't exclude them from decision-making, but also of power. But so the way Lugonis also explains this is that by this introduction of so-called European values, they were reduced not only so to only be caretakers, but they didn't even have other roles, important roles in societies. Next to that, she mentioned that through how Western feminisms or white feminists were thinking about emancipation, were excluding certain ways and cultures that did not completely adhere to these Western constructs. And I will come back to this in a bit. I want to just mention someone else, Jack Alexander. So Jack Alexander works mostly on Trinidad and Tobago and Bahamas from the English Caribbean, the former English Caribbean. And in this article in Feminist Review in 1994, she talks about not just anybody can be a citizen, because some people are more productive than others. And what's interesting about this work is that she combines both the time of colonialism and after colonialism, so during post-colonial time, to say that a lot of times the nation is being taught as something as a heterosexual, or that only heterosexuals are counted as citizens. So one of the ways she's trying to say this is through the regulation of gender and sexuality through laws, right? So you might know that in the English Caribbean inherited a lot of the sodomy laws from UK, right? Wherein certain relationships, so mostly non-normative relationships, were regulated. But even after colonialism, so after independence, these laws were kept. So these caps were not contested. Even though colonialism itself was contested, these colonial laws were not contested. So they were adopted and actually also integrated in what it means to be an English Caribbean a citizen. So in this very interesting article, she links ideas about regulating gender through laws, sexuality, race, and class to pinpoint that even though colonialism is over, within post-colonialism, we should be careful not to reproduce all of these aspects. So in a sense, she's saying that the state mobilizes heterosexuality. So through ideas of the heterosexual family, through ideas of we need to still regulate and persecute different homosexual or trans practices, but also in a very social scene, undermining different or other sexual orientations. And this can be very subtle things. So it can be people dismissing people's gender performance, but it can also be parents not accepting their child, right? So it can be very subtle issues. And she says that we need a broader analytical framework to understand these issues. So if we only addresses the colonial past or the current post-colonial issues in terms of freedom, for example, in terms of, for example, looking at only at the slavery past or looking only at certain legislation in terms of citizenship that we need to look at, but not, for example, looking at gender sexuality, that will miss the whole point. So she's saying we need a broader framework to look into these aspects. So in this sense, the coloniality of gender is still interesting and important because it informs the ways a lot of countries still think of so-called third world countries or so-called global south countries. So for example, in Curaçao, there was this idea in the 1994 that the Curaçao women were too homosexual and thus not modern, right? So this parliamentarian went to Curaçao, and we'll talk about him in a bit. He went to Curaçao and he saw a lot of women doing things. What they were was not clear, but he was shocked, and he was saying there were bosom friendships and women taking care of children, and this needs to stop, basically. And so they were not modern. But what's interesting about this idea of not being modern enough is that this framework is still being used today. However, because now the Netherlands is seen as this progressive homosexual paradise, this framework is still used, but now they say, for example, Curaçao is not modern enough because they don't have the legislation to back this up, right? So again, the framework is still used, but the Netherlands is seen as modern always. And in this case, Curaçao is seen as not modern. So only I would say the stipulations are changed, but the framework stays the same. And it also brings about ideas of intersectional feminism. So as we know, it complicates this idea of not only looking, for example, at race, but also at gender, sexuality, disability, to make a more complex picture of our lives. And in that sense, this is also the goal, right? So if we want a decolonial future, we should also think about these aspects within that future. And what does it mean? What does it mean then if we would think about gender sexuality within our decolonial future? So we will think about that after the lecture. So we will be very much hands-on trying to work with this idea. But I want now to translate what I've said through the Dutch context. And the Dutch context is a very complex situation where the Dutch has been colonizing left and right. And these are only a few places that they colonized. And what is not here is, for example, Curaçao, that has been colonized by the Dutch, at least, from 1634 with some intermissions. We can talk about intermissions if you want. And the difficulty of these all is that how can we think about the different parts of the Dutch colony together without homogenizing them as such. So to only think that because, for example, Indonesia or what is now called New York and Brazil and Curaçao and Suriname were all colonized by the Dutch, it doesn't mean that we have the same frameworks to analyze them as such, right? So they are all different. The only thing they have in common is that the Dutch colonized them. And this also, you can see that back in different ways, how the Dutch regulated sexuality and gender, yeah? So I will skip a few things, but if you have questions about some things, you ask me, please. So the Dutch started to regulate non-normative sexuality early on from the 18th century. So in the Netherlands itself, we had the pre-Napoleonic code. And in this time, so in the 18th century, you see a lot of most of the sodomy persecutions. The most famous one was the Utrecht sodomy persecution, where hundreds of people were put to trial and killed. And then, so, and also during this time, you saw more and more countries being colonized by the Dutch. So you would think that no, I would say shirts like this. So there was this rule, which was this rule of what is enacted in the Netherlands should also be enacted everywhere in the colonies. Yeah. However, this was not the case always. So it depended a lot on the governor or on how strict the judges were on this specific colony. So it different through times, right? And also it different through, so on the status. So if someone was very rich, they might not get the same treatment. Or, for example, if this person didn't confess, for example. So there was this whole problem of we need a confession in order to put someone on trial. And sometimes this confession was very violently, so they tried to let someone confess through different methods. So by cutting fingers and so on. So they would try to still get some confessions through these measures. So you can already see that how it was regulated was very difficult, but also it also changed through time and place. What's important to know is that after the 19th century, sodomy. So after the Dutch was colonized by France, right? So during the Napoleonic Code, all sodomy laws were removed. Yeah. And then for the first time in 1911, there was this special age of consent. So it was the age of consent was called law was 248 bis law, which differentiated between homosexual sex and heterosexual sex. So in this law introduced in 1911, homosexual sex, so you could not have a relationship with someone under 21 years old if you would had a homosexual relationship, whereas with a heterosexual relationship, this was 16. So there was a difference in gender and how they were regulated. And to think about coloniality as we started the presentation. So after in the Netherlands, this specific law was removed in 1971, it was also removed in the Dutch Caribbean islands. But because Suriname and Indonesia were at that time or already independent or in the process of becoming independent, they did not remove this law, and it's still a remnant of the Dutch colonial past. So what this is clear about these regulation is not only that these people were regulated, but also it shows that same-sex desiring people did exist, right, from early on. And in the case of Curaçao, you see that through, as I said, camaraderie relationships that this parliamentarian was talking about at the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century. So what is camaraderie? So camaraderie, this is a definition from the erotic dictionary from Curaçao from 1992. And at one hand, camaraderie are two women who have an intimate relationship with each other, so sexual intercourse, for example, or sexual intercourse. But also, which is not mentioned here, it also indicates a more amicable relationship. So it was not always clear if it was an erotic or just friends, right? And this you can also see in the descriptions of these women, that you see a lot of these white men who were writing about them, they were frustrated by them, but you could not actually pinpoint why they were mad. Were they mad because they were just friends? And I was also wondering, reading these books, and I was thinking, what did you see? And how did you see that, right? So there's also these ideas of how gossip may play a role in these descriptions of these women. So basically, there were three books about these women up until 1925. So the first one is from a school teacher in 1886, Brussels. The second one is from this parliamentarian, Van Kool, in 1904. And in 1923, Kroon. So Brussels and Van Kool, they're both Dutch. So Van Kool is a parliamentarian, and Brussels is a school teacher that came from the Netherlands to work in Curaçao. And Kroon, on the other hand, was a Curaçaoan living in Curaçao. And he was working with the Roman Catholic Church. So what you can discern from this picture is that after abolition of slavery, people were preoccupied with how to educate the recently freed. Yeah. So they were very much preoccupied to regulate how these people would deal with their freedom. So they didn't think they could deal with their freedom in a way that was acceptable, so they had to regulate it in some sort. In a sense, in this period, you don't have any legal regulations about Cambrara. Yeah. So of course, in 1915, which was 4 years after the introductions of the 1911 Age of Consent, and 3 years before it was enacted in Curaçao. So it was not immediately enacted in Curaçao. So as you see here, only in 1918, the Age of Consent was introduced in Curaçao and the colonies. So after the oil refinery was opened in Curaçao, there was also a lot of tension within a lot of authorities, because they felt that a lot of people outside of Curaçao who didn't have a Roman Catholic lifestyle would come and mess up with these lifestyles that are proper and Roman Catholic, right? So Krohn wrote a novel, actually, writing about a woman, a Cambrara woman, who was living a very bad life, and in the end, she dies, and but she repents her sins. And these novels, there were plenty of them about other topics, for example, drinking a lot, or incest, or different topics. They were read out loud to the community, because some of the people were they could not read. They were read out loud by the priest, but also members of the community. So in a sense, you see that the novel was an addition to this legal law, right? So some people thought that this legal this law was not enough. So we had to think of other measures, such as cultural practices, such as a novel, to regulate these women. So these are the 3 books. And in a sense, they were all very negative about these women. And I will show you some quotes in a bit. So they all show very much a prejudice regarding women in this Cambrara relationship. So again, to summarize, the books by Brussel and Van Kool, so the first 2 written in Dutch, fall in the first period and show how Europeans in the colonies dealt with the aftermath of slavery through their descriptions of Cambrara women. After the abolition of slavery, the Roman Catholic Church, so the 3rd book, felt the need to educate Afro-Curaçaoans, especially children and women, how to be respectable. And the book by Krohn, written in Papiamento, so the other 2 first books were written in Dutch, and they were also meant for a metropolitan, a European audience. And the 3rd book was written in Papiamento for the lower social class, to show how female same-sex erotic relationships and immigrants to the islands became indicators of moral decay, and how the Roman Catholic Church played a crucial role in shaping attitudes towards women engaging in Cambrara relationships. So again, there was a side-by-side regulation, not only by the state, but also the Roman Catholic Church. So I want to finish this more historical part to come to the 70s and 80s, to show how this idea of Cambrara still persisted up until then, right? So even though these works are very much colonial and also very negative, you can also see some traces of these women's lives, even though these very racist and sexist texts. So it shows some crucial dimensions of these women's lives that you cannot otherwise find, right, anymore, because they didn't had, so they didn't record their voices in other ways. They didn't write their own books. So these are, for now, the only ways we can actually get a glimpse into their lives. I want to move to the 70s and 80s, where someone like Frida Martina also had a lot of linkages with these Cambrada women, even though it's like 70 years apart. And for me, it also let us rethink ideas about identity and sexuality. So to recap, Cambrada women were women that had a Cambrada relationship, but did not call themselves Cambrada. So it was not an identity, but a more practice-based relationships. So you're not a Cambrada, but you do a Cambrada, or you have a Cambrada relationship. Is it clear? Yeah. So this is also something you can see back in Frida Martina. So Frida Martina was actually involved in a lot of the so-called lesbian movement in the Netherlands. She died in 2014, unfortunately. But even though she was in these circles, every time she questions the very term lesbianism. So she says, when asked in a gay magazine, no, this was a panel discussion about queer theater or lesbian theater, and so she knew, because it was a lesbian conference, so she was invited there at the lesbian panel about lesbian theater, and someone asked her, "Hey, do you make lesbian theater?" And she said, "Well, I would like to ask other questions. So far, the definition of the term lesbian is not clear to me. That's one. How it works in practice makes that question gesture." And you hear laughter from the audience. Furthermore, I think if you only approach being a lesbian from either a social or romantic perspective, it's incredibly limited. I live and work with a woman, but don't call it lesbianism. So in a sense, what's interesting here is that I think of course she knew what lesbianism is, but she questions this idea that it was a universal label that could be applied to her, right? And what she also does is that she says, my understanding of my relationship is not only social or romantic, it's also related to labor. Yeah. So this is not something that only she was talking about. This is something also that was happening at the same time. This is in the 80s. So at one point in the 84, Audre Lorde came to the Netherlands, and she had a very interesting and beautiful conversation with Astrid Roemer. And I don't know if you know Audre Lorde. So she would say, I'm a Black lesbian mother. So she has all these identities that she claims, right? Whereas Astrid Roemer says, no, if I articulate these labels, it also kills them. I have relationship with these women, but it is not necessary to categorize them or label them. They can coexist. And it's not about being in the closet, so to speak. It's more about a different understanding of sexuality. And I wanted to also mention this is not to say that you cannot be a lesbian or a gay or queer, but to say that it also opens up other ways of being, other ways of doing sexuality. So Martina questions the self-evident and universal meaning of the term lesbian. Like many other Caribbean thinkers, think of also Gloria Wekker, Drumer, she rejected this term in the local context of Dutch Caribbean. These terms, mainly originating in a Euro-USA context, these scholars argue, are devoid of any cultural and historical specificity to the Caribbean and contribute to the erasure of local words and culture relating to gender sexuality. I want to share two other issues, and then we can take a break. So Martina's repeated refusal of the term lesbian while also participating at the Lesbian Festival reminds me of this idea of strategic entanglement. So in a sense, this idea of being within a situation or a conference, for example, of lesbian and still critique it. Or, for example, I think of ways in which we can still be in the Netherlands and still critique it, right? So a way of crafting and acting at autonomy within a system from which one is unable to fully disentangle. We can talk about it in a minute. I just want to close with this fragment.
Ik ben een beroemde flikker op Curaçao. En ook denk ik door het feit dat ik kunstenaar ben, wordt mijn flikker zijn geaccepteerd.
Het is voor mij niet zo van, ik moet nu zo nodig. Dus op het moment dat ik dat doe, dan is het ook met iemand waar ik ook echt iets mee voel. En dan is het voor mijzelf ook, maakt het in principe niet eens zoveel uit of het met een man of met een vrouw is. Het is wel zo dat ik merk in mijn leven dat ik heel veel wel voor vrouwen kies, omdat ik het geduld gewoon niet kan opbrengen met mannen.
Homoseksualiteit op de Nederlandse Antillen. De Nederlandse Antillen hebben ongeveer 150.000 inwoners. En hier in Nederland wonen zo'n 40.000 Antillianen. Op de Antillen bestaat nog de Nederlandse wetgeving. En ook Nederlandse gewoonten zijn hier veelal overgenomen. De filmregisseur Felix de Rooij en actrice Friedi Martina vertellen aan Ali Karatjebaai in hoeverre op de Antillen anders over homoseksualiteit wordt gedacht dan hier in Nederland.
En daarnaast is het zo dat, voor zover ik weet, uit eigen ervaring en ook uit horen zeggen, dat het heel erg als een adder onder het gras is. Hè? En erg veel mensen doen eraan mee. En iedereen zijn neus bloedt. Van de andere kant vind ik dat niet per definitie iets wat je zou moeten verafschuwen. Want ik geloof dat het in ieder geval in onze culturen zo is dat als je zin hebt om iets te doen, dan doe je dat gewoon. Dus naar mijn weten is het zo dat in ieder geval van vrouwen, dat er een heleboel vrouwen met vrouwen vrijen. Maar dat maakt hun niet per definitie lesbisch. Over het algemeen durf ik te zeggen dat de niet-westerse vrouw voor haar seksuele behoeften opkomt. Als ze dat echt wilt, dan doet ze dat. Dus kan ze het ook met een vrouw doen. Want het is ook zo, omdat wij ook nog vanuit de zon en weet ik wat, de sensualiteit altijd aanwezig voelen. En je weet ook als vrouw wat je in je hebt, dan is het ook heel normaal dat die vrouwen dat met elkaar uitwisselen. Dat gebeurt ontzettend vaak. Bijvoorbeeld, ik heb zelf een tante gehad die met een vrouw samenleefde. En dat werd oogluikend gewoon toegestaan. Iedereen wist het. Sorry. En voor zover ik dat weet, ik heb het laatst ook nog gehoord, weet je wel, bij zo'n familiereunie. En dan, Nou, er zijn meerdere mensen kennelijk in mijn familie of in de naaste familiekring en vriendenkring van de familie, die het met vrouwen deden. Ik geef ze geen ongelijk.
Kan een homorelatie heel lang duren op de Antillen?
Kan een relatie überhaupt lang duren? Ik vind het ontzettend moeilijk, de manier van denken hier in het Westen, dat alles in een hokje moet zijn.
Maar kunnen twee vrouwen of twee mannen met elkaar wonen daar?
Ik heb een vriendin die samen met een andere vrouw woont. Die heb ik. Alleen is het zo dat het voor de maatschappij, want ik had het zelf heel lang niet door. Vermoeden het wel, maar officieel deelden ze samen een huis. Dat kan ook. Snap je?
Maar ze hadden een seksuele relatie met elkaar.
Ja.
En voor de buitenwereld?
Voor de buitenwereld niet. Snap je? Dus dat soort dingen gebeuren altijd. Ik bedoel, ik vertelde straks ook het verhaal van mijn tante. Voor de buitenwereld zijn het gewoon 2 vriendinnen. En ze hebben ook 3 kinderen geadopteerd. Dus het zijn 2 ouders.
Hebben Antilliaanse lesbische vrouwen in Nederland hun eigen groep?
Ja. Je hebt namelijk de Stichting Flamboyant, hè? Hier in Amsterdam. Waar wat voor zwarte vrouwen is. En daar hebben ze ook avonden met zwarte lesbische vrouwen.
Maar ben je niet op zo'n avond geweest?
Jawel. En ik heb ook met ze gedanst.
Praat je dan niet over lesbisch zijn op zo'n avond? Het is toch een lesbische avond?
Nee, ik bedoel, dat weet je. Ik bedoel, je weet, er zijn vrouwen die van vrouwen houden. Ik bedoel, ik heb daar geen probleem mee. Dat is ook weer echt zo'n Nederlands problematiek, weet je. Alles is een probleem. Nou, ik word er doodziek van. Ik bedoel, op een gegeven moment, als met een vrouwenavond... Ik heb hier ook vrouwenavonden georganiseerd. 1 keer per maand. Er kwamen alleen maar lesbische vrouwen. Ik had nooit een avond over lesbische vrouwen georganiseerd om erover te praten. Nooit niet. Waar moet ik nog over praten? Hoe je het doet? Nou, dan wordt ze te ondeugend.
So what I wanted to show by this clip, and also the discussion of Frida Martina, is not only how certain practices still remain unchanged through time, but also ways in which we can critique certain aspects of ourselves in perhaps not very radical, but maybe subtle ways. Thank you so much. We can now maybe do a few minutes of questions, if you have one, and then we can go to the next part.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, you can unmute yourself or just throw it in the chat if you're too shy. Can you see it, the chat, or should I read it to you?
I can now. Yeah, thank you. We can go to the other part.
I have questions, but it's more practical.
Oh,
so
yes.
it would be maybe better for the workshop, a discussion for the workshop part.
Yeah. Sure. So yes, maybe we can do the workshop part. It does require us to be a bit active. So what I was thinking about in this case is to, and if you want, you can also put your camera on so we can engage. Oh, there's a question. Has a queer person ever studied the heterosexual life like Rebecca studied about innocence, kind of like a straight innocent, if that makes any sense? Oh, that's interesting. I don't think so. Let me think. No, I don't think so. So the issue, so what not only white innocence, but also the politics of passion. So in that sense, Godebecker went to Suriname during her PhD and did a very lengthy field work there and tried to capture this whole world of the Mati. So Mati is kind of similar to Cambrara. There are some differences, but so in that sense, she captured this whole system of how they dressed, maybe in twin clothing, how they were practicing in the Winti religion. So it was very comprehensive. I think that it was not done because up until recently, I think maybe from the 90s, 2000s, the heterosexual relationship was seen as the norm. So it was not challenged, or it was just thought of like, this is the norm. So it's not also interesting or important to research. So hopefully someone or maybe one of you can do that soon. The second one is amazing personal. Do you think that the tension over label focus on visual identity stems from Western colonialism? Oh, so so in a sense, this is a very difficult question also. It seems simple, but it's a very difficult question because at the one hand, you have the taxonomy. I don't know if you know the taxonomy of race, for example. You had the same for gender, but within animals. So you have this very idea of what is typically male butterfly and what is typically female butterfly. So very gendered ways of thinking. So in that sense, these taxonomies created labels and also difference. And at the same time, there are some communities that had different genders, of course, that were not introduced by the colonialism. So it's a more complicated issue. And what I also need to say is that I think I would be very careful to say that there's a beautiful saying, and I'll try to paraphrase it in a good way. So there's a saying about Africa. So there's this imagined idea of Africa, this whole continent as an imagined nation, right? And there's a place called Africa where there's a pre-colonial mantra that homophobia is un-African, and a post-colonial mantra that homosexuality is un-African. So in a sense, what is interesting about this quote is that they say that in both cases, so in both the pre-colonial and in the post-colonial moment, this idea of Africa, which is an imagined idea, creates also a kind of utopia. So I think we should also be careful to think that before colonialism, it was a heaven, right? In some cases, it was. And we should also be careful what is now much more common to label a whole country anti or not homosexual enough, right? So it's also very, we should be careful about that. Other questions? Otherwise, I will go to the, oh, yes.
So yeah, somebody asked about, I think Max asked about the research, and you said, yeah, maybe one of you can do that. But I feel like when it's precarious when it regards precarious communities in colonized places, neo-colonized places, we have to be careful with going and doing research. I feel like Gloria Becker was a specific case of someone who has the background from that specific place, has intimate relationships with people in that space. It's different when we, you know, educated in a Westernized university, go over there with our Western cultural logic, which we may or may not realize very often do not realize that it's Western cultural logic because it's so naturalized and universalized, like the air that we breathe. So we can go over there and impose our Western cultural logic. I'm thinking of specifically the invention of women, Oyewumi Oyeronke, where well-meaning feminist scholars went to Yoruba, I think they were anthropologists, and saw certain, oh, sorry, my alarm, cultural practices. And they said, oh, that's gender, which was not. The Yoruba didn't know gender, didn't have gender in our culture. And so they invented gender for the Yoruba, causing actual harm, epistemic genocide, etc., and so forth. So now the Yoruba know gender and practice gender. So things like that, I feel, especially Suriname, we have a lot of stagiaires there. You know? Our being is like a evasion of the stagiaires every, you know, term. You know, that's why I'm like, oh, hold up, wait a minute.
Yes.
That's why I'm making this comment. Like, I feel like this is something that needs to be discussed because there are certain debates, you know, about like certain fields are very reflective now, like anthropology. I'm in cultural analysis. We're very reflective and very critical, but what I feel like is missing is self-criticism. And even when you are self-critical, like you can publish your journal and have other critical people read it, but if you're all coming from the same place, from the same cultural logic, even though you're all critical together, you may still have some blind spots that you don't see. So I feel, I don't know if this is something for the workshop. I don't know what y'all want to do in a workshop, but I feel like in the whole debate about should we teach Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Hegel, should, you know, how are we self-critical, how are we critical of Foucault, Derrida, etc. What I feel is missing is self-criticism with the you know, taking account that we also have certain blind spots, you know, certain things that we don't, these well-meaning feminists didn't realize that gender is not a thing. Like every class that I take in my program discusses gender, you know? So for me, when I read The Invention of Women, I was like, oh shit, gender was colonial, hey, you know? And I realized when I look at my own culture, it's like, yeah, it's colonial. It's not a thing that we have everywhere. Like it's not omnipresent. But if you are in a westernized university, you would think, oh, gender is omnipresent. Like the you know, the air that I breathe is like everywhere. You don't even realize that it's there, like air, you know? So yeah, I feel like, yeah, do research, but with a caveat that you don't cause harm. You like, I feel like, yeah, don't cause harm should be the starting point, but also realizing that because we come from a hegemonic system, we can cause harm, like it's inevitable. And how do we, like, what tools can we develop amongst ourselves as decolonial thinkers, as scholars who don't want to go over there and cause harm, maybe shouldn't go over there and cause, you know, I don't know. But like the don't cause harm is something that I'm really thinking about and I'm struggling with, because I also see the things that I write, maybe I come back to it in a year and I'm a student, so like the harm that I cause is minimal, but still, you know, I feel like the things that I have access to in the UvA library, for instance, they're outdated, you know? So I may use, I was writing about Louise Bennett. I don't know if you know the Jamaican poet. And my sources were outdated, you know? And then when I came back to it, I was like, shit, you know, the way they talk about patois, for instance, as though it's like a dialect or, you know, like, no, it's not, you know, it's a language. And that is also, you know, colonial to see it like a dialect or something that is sub, you know, or that is secondary or less than, or, you know, it's very colonial way of looking at it. So that's one example that I can give, that as a student who's, you know, I see myself as someone who's very decolonial, but I still, because this cultural logic is so omnipresent, like the air that I breathe, I still, you know, do things that cause harm, that could cause harm, like saying patois is a dialect or whatever. You know, when it's a language now, and people have fought since the beginning to say that it's including Louise Bennett, ironically, who I was writing about. So yeah.
So I think I agree with everything. I want to add maybe a footnote. So I think, because you ask also what kind of tools can we create, right?
Yeah.
And I think Gloria gives us this, because, for example, Gloria was born in Suriname, but moved when she was 1 to the Netherlands, right? And when she writes Politics of Passion, she meets this very old lady, where she also has a relationship with this lady, right? And I think we both read this text together once, right?
Yeah, it reads like the novel, the opening. Yeah.
So in this introduction, she also mentions the mistakes she did, right? So she also talks about that. So she read about the Mati in books by white, like old white man, but she didn't know it was existed, and she made a lot of mistakes how she addressed Miss Julie, I think, as she called. So in a sense, I think this reflective can also be put into actual work. So we can also, so one, I agree with you, we shouldn't be trying to make mistakes, but we can also be reflective in our work instead of showing a very neat picture. We can also say, shit, I went to this interview and I mistakenly said patois as a dialect. And because of that, this person got mad. So then people know, right? So it's also it's a complicated thing, and I agree with you that we shouldn't. How can I say this? So I'm also very wary to also send my students wherever. I think you should have a kind of a intersection with the people you want to study for lots of reasons. Yeah. I think Max has a question.
Or maybe more clarification, because I totally agree with what Disco Fox added, like, let's not do harm studying again. What I meant more in the question was that with White Innocent, she was one of the first in the Dutch context to study whiteness. So looking back from, let's say, the other side to what's the psychology of, let's say, the oppressor and how that functions. So studying that heteronormativity, because what I liked about the audio fragment that you showed was that actually the interviewer was subtly quite made ridiculous, because she was quite a mirror, like, I don't know what you're even worried about, and was a bit the same with this crone that is like, oh my god, these women are kissing, you know, and being all worried about it, like. So it's, for me, it's like it tells something more about them than on the other side, but usually we study what is not the norm. So that was where the question came from. Can we look back, because they're acting really ridiculous, I can't get into their mind state, but it has to be understood, because apparently quite a big chunk of society is functioning in that way. So that was more where the question was directed from, like, can we study them back?
Right.
Into it. Yeah.
No, I think so. Still, I don't know anyone, but I think it is something we should study. And in my case, it's actually indeed more interesting to study the 3 people writing about Cambrada and the church instead of the Cambrada themselves, right? Because in my case, it's also sometimes, I think, by highlighting or making something more visible, it also makes them a target, right? Also in an epistemological sense. So for me, it's more interesting to say, okay, there's this guy fascinated by these women. Why? And try to understand that psyche instead of the other way around. So yeah, thank you for that. I think Disco Fox has another question.
Yeah, I do. So it's interesting that you are talking about by studying them, you also make them a target. It makes me think of licence for opacity, this decree, we have the right to opacity, but also going back to when we coming from a westernized university setting, we look at a different, so I read, or I'm in the process of reading Sylvia Wynter's interesting article. It's called, with a funny title, "The Pope Must Have Been Drunk and the King of Castile a Madman." I don't know if you know it, from 1995. It's online, it's open, you can find it, a PDF. Anyway, this is what I'm talking about. Like when you mentioned this episode with Gloria Wekker in Politics of Passion, is somebody from that culture herself. So someone from a different cultural logic pointed out to her, like, no. So to this person from this different cultural logic, what we come in with and oppose on them, our view, is like we're drunk, like we're drunk. And like in my reflection, I feel like, because like if you have your work read by someone else, like a teacher or a friend or a decolonial comrade or whoever, they're also coming from the different cultural logic. Yep. But someone coming from a totally different cultural logic, like this Gloria Wekker's Mati, or the people looking at what the Pope and the King of Castile were doing and thinking, they're drunk, they're mad, They have a different view, and they point out to you like this. So I was thinking, the only way of knowing this is that what we're doing, our way of thinking, also why I know that calling patois a dialect is not correct is also because someone from that other culture logic told me when I was talking to them about my essay. So that could be a tool, but on the other hand, how can that, like someone else from a different cultural logic checking our work could be a tool, but also like it could also be a burden, another way of colonizing, imposing, oppressing, whatever. So like, if this is a tool, how do you do it, unpaid labor? How do you do it in a way that you don't, that you don't create another problem on top of, what's already happening. And even if it's people in a university, because in this essay by Sylvia Wynter, the Pope Must Have Been Drunk, there's also this issue of the people who are educated in the colonies or neo-colonies, they're from a certain class, very often educated in the West, so they have also this Western cultural logic, or they have this privileged position because they also oppress. Like, how do you know that they're really, not causing harm, that that our agenda is not to cause harm? I don't know if we can answer this question, because it's very heavy and a lot, but I feel like I'm still thinking of the tools. And I think that, yeah, like you said, one of the tools is like how Gloria Wekker did it, but it's difficult. And also, like, my friend told me, hey, what the fuck, so it's difficult to establish unless you have these relationships, yeah, I don't know. I think this is very,
I think it's a very difficult question. And I think so, from not talking about it, so this is these old white men doing research without thinking about it. From now, we are reflecting upon it, and hopefully we can come with a set of tools, better tools. I think some of the tools you mentioned are great and people are using it, but indeed it creates other problems, like how do you reimburse time and money, and so it's a very complicated issue. Huh?
Opacity as well, the right to opacity, like all of these things we have to take into account. And I feel like in all of the debates that I've seen so far, obviously, you know, I'm not clued into everything. Not a lot of people are discussing it. I remember that we were discussing when we were in the reading group for Gloria Wecker, like her approach was very unorthodox.
Yeah,
and she
then and now.
The fact that is very unorthodox, and she realizes that, you know, it was just also quite remarkable that she shows us this very unorthodox approach.
Yeah.
So maybe the answer is we have to approach things in a very unorthodox way that is not the regular way.
Yeah.
And if we do so, how? Taking into account opacity, the fact that certain communities are very precarious, so opacity is actually preserving life, and so on and so forth, labor, and so on and so forth. And I see this coming back in the answers that the Friedi, was it Friedi?
Yeah. Friedi Martina, yeah.
The fragment that you let us hear. She was very, you know, evasive maneuvers.
Yeah.
You know, she's not giving a straight answer.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a very complicated question, and I also don't think we should copy the method of politics of passion, because it's a very controversial also. I don't know if it goes into the ethical committee nowadays, because she had a relationship. So it's a very messy and great reading, but it's a very difficult thing. And I think we still need to grapple with how to do it. And I like your suggestion to create relationships, basically. I think Jake also has a question.
Yes, I do have a question. It's also just a time note. Got about 10 more minutes of this session, but I wanted to, maybe I'm taking this question a little bit away, but it's still kind of related. And part of why I was so excited about this session is something I noticed a lot happening is there's people who are involved in decolonization, maybe elders, men of color, who have these goals of decolonization and have these widespread goals, but when it comes to gender and sexuality are still very backwards in thinking. And so this was part of one of the things I wanted to maybe workshop is like how to go about that, like how when you're in a setting, an activist setting, and you're talking about decolonization and you get just completely shut down by perhaps an older man who has these goals of decolonization but still has these very Western views on gender and sexuality and almost these sexist mentalities. And it's kind of this interesting combination, right, of decolonizing mindset but still like holding on to like these other parts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so this is, I think we have this conversation over the phone for a bit, and I will say first how I feel and then what I wanted to do in this workshop, because we cannot do it anymore. But so I feel, so I don't know how people see me. I don't know. This is up to them. But so I feel sometimes very uneasy in a lot of these spaces. And I don't know how to approach these people, these men. And sometimes you experience, and I see a lot of these interactions of how people are treated, right? So what I wanted to do in this workshop, and maybe you can take it as an exercise, everyone in the meeting. So I wanted you to tell me, or not tell me, but to upload via a platform called Padlet, experiences with machismo, experiences with sexism, or bias towards gender, sexual, non-conforming groups. And then to have a set of answers, and then as a group or in breakout groups, to then do this idea of care. I don't know if you know the concept of care framework, which is, so I will put it in the chat, and it's basically a start for conversations, right? So first is to contextualize it. So the person who submitted the situation contextualizes the experience, and tries to understand the root of it, right? So try to understand how it came about, blah, blah. Then the next step is together to analyze it. So break down the experience into different elements, yeah? So you ask for, is it perpetuating a form of hegemony? Which one? Is it steeped in patriarchal values? How so? Is it a byproduct of colonial position? How do you see that? And then it's a question of reconstruction. So then it's about, let's redo the whole situation through a decolonial sense. What decolonial means to us. How would this issue be approached differently in a society free from patriarchal colonial legacies? So then you rephrase the situation together through a conversation and discussion, right? And then the last one, which is the most important one, is to focus on actionable steps that can empower individuals and communities to address the issues in their day-to-day lives. So for me, it is, again, not a very clear cut. This is a tool you just need to press, and then it will be fine. Because I do think, even in my case, where I'm a bit hesitant, I think there's a conversation that needs to be had that is not happening, right? And these are, especially these people that are comrades, right? So I think through these steps, I will now enter. Maybe it can help to start a conversation. Because sometimes, so sometimes it's more have to do with unknowingness. And I would like to think that is not always very, especially with comrades, I must stress, it's not always from a very bad intention. So that's why I think conversation is very interesting. So this is a long-winded answer to your question.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. It's good. It's a good tool. Right. Maybe we can open it up for one last question. Yeah.
One question?
Yeah, does anyone else have a question or comment or thing to workshop? I guess that was what the workshop was going to be, right? Was talking about experiences. Maybe we could mention another experience before we wrap up. Yeah, Max?
Maybe more message of hope with, let's say, the difference in generations, that sometimes I feel we cannot change everyone's mindset anymore at a certain point. But I do feel like for the next generation, it has the capacity to relearn and that it's gonna change. So it's like a dying idea, let's say, the heteronormativity. So it's also like so it's more like I sometimes try to focus on what's coming next and not put too much energy in something we cannot change anymore in certain generations. I hope that I'm right, but that's, I don't know, my sense of hope with it.
Yeah. Should we do the exercise or should we stop? Or Igmara?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I'm leaving my camera off because I have my clothes in the back. Anyways, so going back to what Disco Fox said about we have to be careful when doing research and stuff, what is concerning me a little bit as well, for example, if we are going to research, let's say, for example, Aruba or Curaçao, and if the researcher also comes from those spaces, yeah, the people that are being researched go along with what is happening in the Western world. So, for example, on Aruba and Curaçao and Bonaire as well, in Papiamento, we don't really know about pronunciations because we only have one for everyone, and it's E. And for me, writing Igmara Shide is still odd to this day to write this. And so even though if we're trying to be careful ourselves, you still have this situation of on the spot itself, it goes along with the Western way of categorizing or boxing in. And that can also maybe influence then how the researcher will have a look at the ones that are being researched. I don't know, it was more a concern instead of like a question. So even if we try to be careful, there's still this way of the space putting themselves in a box because they want to go along with the Western situation and neglecting their own knowledge, you could say, what they have in their own country.
So thank you so much. So while I'm just listening to you, I'm also thinking, because you are also my student, so I'm thinking, oh, I need to also think for you in different ways. And I just wonder now that we don't use the E a lot. So while a lot of people use this idea of they, right, in English from the Dutch Caribbean islands, I think it's very interesting also to use the E, right, in these instances. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Which I never thought before this, because I
But
also
if
use.
you, for example, the it now, sorry, I'm interrupt. If I use the it now, but we're having a discussion in English, then it takes away the context that I'm trying to force something that is actually the everyday, so that the other person, so that I can accommodate the other person if I use the it instead of she, they.
Yeah. So it's actually, so yeah, so indeed the A would only make sense within a Western context, right? So it's only critiquing then the Western centric notion, but not in the local context, because in a local context, the A is for everyone, right? Yeah. I think it's something I don't have an answer to, but it's an interesting thought, especially this idea of going back to Aruba or Curaçao and finding something that is also removed from Western ideas. So this is a very interesting idea. We need to talk about it more.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're running out of time right now, but maybe we can stop the recording, and then if people want to hang out and talk for a bit, they can do that. But I wanted to also first just thank you. We hope you enjoy the session, and make sure to like and follow our page, DLS.